Okay, I think we're ready. Good evening. I am Ken Clarke, Director of the Tompkins County Office of Human Rights, and want to welcome you to tonight's program, Building Democracy, Your Voice, Your Vote. Thank you for taking time from your busy schedules to join us. This program is sponsored by a number of local community organizations, the Tompkins County Office of Human Rights, the Tompkins County Human Rights Commission, the Poor People's Campaign, Eastern Southern Tier, the Alliance of Families for Justice, Central New York, the Dorothy Cotton Institute, Cayuga Health System, Rejoice the Vote, Ultimate Reentry Opportunity, or URO, the League of Women Voters of Tompkins County, and the Finger Lakes Independence Center. Individuals from each of these organizations have met on a bi-weekly basis since last July to organize a local civic engagement and voting initiative. This is the first of a set of monthly programs focused on these issues. In October, there will be a panel of youth who will be discussing voting. November will feature a discussion on ex-offenders and their voting rights. December follows with a focus on health, civic engagement, and human rights. In 2023, this civic engagement voting initiative will continue with a program in each quarter of the year, while the group will also publicly engage our community on these issues in other ways. Paul Lieb, in his book, Soul of a Citizen, writes about how everyday people, seemingly powerless people, can make significant social change. Lieb's comments are similar to those voiced by Martin Luther King Jr., who said almost always, the created, dedicated minority has made the world better. These creative minorities have made significant contributions to the quality of life in their communities and the nations through political and non-political processes. They have fostered social change through social action that contributes to civic life and to civic good. In a nutshell, that is what civic engagement is about. Lieb and King's words are to the contrary of the sentiment of numerous citizens who think participation in our communities don't count, that voting makes no difference, that the divisions in our nation are too many and too big to ever be solved. So many people, as a result, choose not to become involved in the lives of their communities in civic activity. We've seen in recent years one of the after effects of that kind of isolation, vulnerability to the social media echo chamber of lies and falsehoods that undermine civic life, social good, and social justice. Lieb says when we shrink from the world, our souls shrink too. So how do we transition from shrinkage to expansion? Expansion is essential to democracy. The late historian and activist Vincent Harding once said, democracy must either expand or it dies. So how do we build democracy in a time democracy is threatened? How do we create space for what Harding called democratic conversations that, in his words, invite us to hear each other's best arguments and best contributions so we can figure out how do we put these things together to make a more perfect union? How can the legacy of Dorothy Cotton, who spent the last 36 years of her life in Ithaca, and the citizenship education program she led in her work with Dr. King inform us. Why is voting essential to civic engagement and democracy itself? We are fortunate tonight to have two well-respected longtime activists, longtime Ithacans, who can answer these and other questions this evening or will address them. Laura Branca is the project manager for the Dorothy Cotton Institute, which mission is to develop, nurture, and train leaders for a global human rights movement. Jeff Furman is founder of Rejoice to Vote, which honors past vanguards of voting rights, celebrates the present through the Votingness City Challenge, and challenges the future in its student voting project. After Laura and Jeff finish with their comments, we will open it up to the audience for questions and answers. Laura and Jeff, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ken.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Jeff, my partner in our endeavors around this stuff. Yeah, so a little bit about Dorothy Cotton. I'm going to share my screen, maybe. Let's see if you can see that. Can you see that? It's okay. Yeah, so the Dorothy Cotton Institute carries the legacy of Dorothy Foreman Cotton. She was a civil rights leader and a person whose name people really should know and be inspired by. Later this fall, we're going to have a documentary about her life and her legacy titled Move When the Spirit Says Move. It should be released later this fall. And we're confident that her story and her spirit are going to encourage people to get involved, to use our voices, and to build the kind of democracy that we really want for ourselves. She was the education director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in the 60s, and she led a powerful 5-day intensive called the Citizenship Education Program. And this program equipped grassroots leaders and activists from all over the southern states to know their constitutional rights, to create a strategy for nonviolent direct action, and to know that there is strength in sharing our common difficulties and our dreams, and to join with others to work for positive change. Well over 10,000 people were able to move from a victim mindset to showing up as fully empowered agents of change and help their communities register to vote, even run for office. And many participants of the CEP became citizenship education teachers and freedom school teachers in their home states. And they organized to get rid of Jim Crow and the illegal practices that kept people down. So that's a little bit about Dorothy. The Dorothy Cotton Institute focuses on human rights education because we all have a universal right to know our rights. And there are actually 5 categories of human rights: civil and political rights, which we'll be focusing on tonight, but also economic, social, and cultural rights. Your vote is powerful, and you may not be interested in elections, but if you don't use your right to vote, you can't get government and society to honor and protect your rights, your other rights, such as to own property, get affordable health care, minimum wage, due process of law, free public education, free speech, marriage equality, freedom from discrimination. All of these things are things that we can advocate for and protect through using our votes. Your ballot is secret, but when a community turns out and votes, politicians and officials begin to see us as a political force. The other thing we focus on is civic participation. As Ken was saying, the importance of getting our voices heard by decision makers and by others whose interests we share, and so that we can join forces for the kinds of change we want to see happen. We also do leadership development because we don't need to wait for the real leaders to show up. This was a mantra of Dorothy Cotton. Don't wait for the real charismatic big shot leaders to show up. Think of yourself as someone who can do something for yourself and for others. And hopefully we will together be building a caring, beloved community that's going to support all of us. So a little bit about the word democracy. It comes from the Greek word demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning power. So democracy is literally power of the people, a way of governing which depends on the will of the people. So let that sink in. This is what we're supposed to be living, but sometimes we're not living that way with one another. You know, there's this phrase that we used to say in training around anti-oppression: ignorance is functional. It's useful to some people to keep us ignorant. If we're ignorant and we don't know our rights, we become more vulnerable to limiting ourselves and living as though our voices don't matter. So information is extremely powerful, and we have a human right to know our rights. This is a great quote from Dr. King. So long as I do not firmly and irrevocably possess the right to vote, I do not possess myself. I cannot make up my mind because it is made up for me. I cannot live as a democratic citizen, observing the laws that I have helped to enact. I can only submit to the edict of others. It's a really provocative statement about the power of voting. So, as Ken was saying in his introduction, we often encounter people who are literally asking or commenting, why vote? Why vote when my vote won't matter anyway? The fix is in. There's no point in putting my heart out and wanting to get my vote to count, or to seeing people I don't believe in, taking office. And I think it's all rigged anyway. So I have relatives like that who think that way. I have people close to me who've said, I'm not voting. So let's talk about why. In 1789, the founding fathers wrote the Constitution, and they granted the states the power to set voting requirements. And so states limited the vote to property owning, tax paying white males, who at the time were 6% of the population. And so if your vote doesn't matter, would it be okay with you if only white men with property could vote? Or how about only men, or only wealthy people? What do you think about that? Democracy breaks if nobody votes. When there's no voting, there's no democracy. Do you want to live in a dictatorship? I don't. Refusing to vote is not rebellion, it's surrender. Dishonest people with terrible ideas can get elected by the number of people who don't vote. Because all of us who are eligible to vote and could register to vote don't exercise that right. So the number of people who actually participate in elections is kind of shockingly small. So if you don't vote, you're helping to elect people that you probably don't want to see be elected. Politicians and elected officials pay attention to people who vote. You think your opinions are being ignored? Well, you could fix that by voting. You'll be invisible and unheard if you don't vote. And voting is also something bigger than ourselves. It's our voice. If you don't vote, you let people down, you let yourself down. By not expressing your will, you let your family down. You may be letting your county or your state or your country down. And by the way, letting your planet down, because some of the things we need to vote on are how to save our planet from catching on fire, flooding, mass extinction. You've heard about it. So those are some reasons why maybe you should think about your vote mattering. And if you have people in your life who are saying it doesn't matter, you can use anything here you want to make an argument for, yes, maybe it does matter. Here are some of the federal legal protections that have been enacted over the last more than a century, 170 years. So the first ones that we are going to focus on were the Reconstruction Amendments. They were the amendments that were enacted after the Civil War ended. The first one was the abolishment of slavery and involuntary servitude, but it had a loophole in it, a very, very significant loophole, which is abolishment of slavery and involuntary servitude, except as punishment if convicted of a crime. That's really important because it really was the basis for the mass incarceration that we see, the rise of imprisoning people and putting them on chain gangs, break-in rocks or whatever, putting them on farms, leasing prisoners out. That was all legalized by making this exception. The 14th Amendment really declared that if you're born or naturalized in the US, you're a citizen of the United States and you have the right to due process. That means people can't take away your property or your life or your liberty without due process in front of the judicial system. There's got to be a reason for that. And equal protection under the law, regardless of race, color, gender, or creed. Well, 15th Amendment said you can't prevent a person from voting just because of their race or their color. And that actually, or their former enslavement, that gave Black men the vote, but not women. It's interesting that Black men actually used that vote in a powerful way. And we saw many Black people rise to become politicians, get elected to Congress. It was a powerful point in the Reconstruction when we really exercised that right, but women couldn't exercise it. Then there was a civil rights law in 1875 that actually got nullified later on because of complaints from the southern states. Amendment 19, that came about in 1920 when women won the right to vote, but not Chinese women, not Native American women, not immigrants, and not women of color living under Jim Crow. Technically, we had the right, but there were so many barriers placed in our way. I'll talk more about that in a minute. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was the most comprehensive civil rights legislation ever enacted. It bans discrimination based on race and color and religion, national origin, and it was great, but it needed some additional stuff. So the Voting Rights Act was enacted in 1965, and it banned the poll tax and literacy tests and intimidation of people around their exercising their vote. There were the Civil Rights Act of 68, which extended the Bill of Rights to the tribes. Took long enough, didn't it? And it included the Fair Housing Act. In 1970, finally, we got the poll tax banned. And in recent times, we granted the vote to people 18 years old. So finally, people who have to go to war and defend our country get to actually vote in our elections. That was kind of a good thing. So I don't expect you to read this slide, but I just wanted to put as many of these things on here as possible. If our votes don't matter, why are there so many barriers to discourage us from voting? I found 61 forms of voter suppression listed at this website, the votingrightsalliance.org. So there are physical barriers, things like waiting long hours on long lines to cast ballots with no chairs and no water, or closing the polling place and moving them, 50 miles out of town so you can't get a bus to go vote. You have to hitch a ride, or you have a long walk ahead of you. Sometimes it means narrowing the time for mail-in voting, or failure to accommodate different languages, or failure to accommodate accessibility needs. It could mean voter intimidation. Having police actually present at polling places can be an intimidating factor for people who don't trust police. Purging voter rolls. And then, of course, there's all the gerrymandering going on in this country, which arbitrarily moves the voting districts so that people who might vote as a block, who live in the same district, who are part of the same race or culture in the majority in their district, all of a sudden get their votes split between districts. So it's an undermining of the power of the collective to cast votes as a block. And then there's, all this stuff about what's gone on with Native Americans, where the polling places don't recognize tribal IDs, or barring people because they don't have a street address. They're living on a reservation. They're living on native lands, and they have post office boxes, and those were getting rejected in the last elections. All the disenfranchisement of felons. So I'm just showing you this to say, look it up. There are so many forms of suppression that are currently going on. They may not all be going on in Tompkins County. We're lucky here. But we have to be on the lookout for how our votes are being suppressed. That tells us something about how powerful our votes are. Why vote? Because people wouldn't be spending all this money and thinking up all these strategies to discourage us from voting if it didn't mean that our votes are really powerful. Why are people threatened by our voting? Why do they spend so much time trying to make it difficult for us to vote? Think about it. I just want to give a shout out to the Sisters of Change. There are many, many, many Sisters of Change who have sacrificed and worked tirelessly for our liberation and for our civil rights. You see here Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, and her children. They were not only abolitionists and fighters for Black liberation, they were staunch suffragists. They wanted the vote. Here's the 19th Amendment, which ostensibly gave women the right to vote, but it didn't guarantee voting rights to all women. And partly we were deterred by things like poll tax. That's basically a fee. When you go register to vote, you would have to, in some states, pay a fee for the right to actually vote. And for people who are low income, living in poverty, that was a big barrier. Or literacy tests, where they would ask you things like how many bubbles in a bar of soap, or how many windows are in the county courthouse, or how many jelly beans are in this jar that's 3 feet tall. And, questions with answers that are impossible for most people, almost anybody, to answer. Or there were no questions, how many bubbles in a bar of soap? There was no answer to that. And yet this would be the excuse for denying someone their voter registration. Arbitrary, capricious, but deadly. And there are other rules that we should know about. Native American people were not even considered US citizens until 1924. Dorothy used to say, we did a whole lot more than march. She was always introduced as Dorothy Cotton, who marched with Dr. King. They were working tirelessly behind the scenes to organize communities, to make sure that people who were traveling from other states had a place to stay and dinner. They did a lot around just making people comfortable and feel safe when they were traveling. They took a bus. She and Andy Young and Septima Clark had a bus, and they drove all over the southern states, gathering people who were known in their communities to be leaders who cared about speaking up on behalf of their people, and brought them to the Dorchester Center in Georgia, where they had these 5-day intensives. And they would learn how to, first of all, know your constitutional rights. Second of all, to understand that a lot of people were experiencing these challenges, this intimidation, this violence. So finding common cause and empathy with one another, and then realizing you can do something about that. By day 3 or day 2, Dorothy was saying, well, why aren't you the county clerk? Why aren't you? If you don't like how people are treating you, how come you don't run for office? And then breaking it down. What is in our way? What was operating under Jim Crow that prevented people from being powerful? And the last thing was they trained people to take nonviolent direct action, because in those circumstances where there were law enforcement and National Guard, there were a lot of guns that were ready to suppress or put down a rebellion or a march or a demonstration. Nonviolence was the smart strategy, and it also captured the conscience of the American people when people saw what was happening to folks on TV. The second picture here is of a woman, an elderly woman, learning to write her name in cursive, because you had to be able to write your name in order to pass the literacy test and be able to get your voter registration. So the citizenship education program flew under the radar as a literacy program, but it was way more radical than that. And it actually equipped a lot of people to make very, very serious changes in their circumstances. Last thing to mention is the Voting Rights Act, which was accomplished in 1965, and it banned the use of the literacy tests. And it also was followed up and backed up by the 24th Amendment that made poll taxes illegal in federal elections, and later on they were banned in state elections by the Supreme Court. So there's lots of legislation, but think about it. Why do we need so many acts, so many amendments, so many laws? Because as long as states have the right to do it their own way, they find loopholes and then create barriers to voting, even if the federal laws say these are our rights. So we have to be constantly vigilant about making sure that our rights are not eroded. And I think we're living in a time when our voting rights, our democratic rights are being eroded. And that's why it's so important to organize our communities and to find our voice and to take action. I'm almost done, Jeff. The last couple of slides. Just to say, 5.2 million Americans cannot vote because of a felony conviction. Now, in New York State, you lose your right to vote when you are in prison for a felony. But if you're released from prison, you can vote. And if you're convicted of a felony and your sentence is suspended, you can vote. All other criminal convictions, misdemeanors and violations, they do not take away your right to vote. They don't even prevent you from voting while you're serving time in jail. So these are rights that people who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated need to know. You're supposed to be able to even register, get your voting rights back while you're in prison. You're supposed to get that information. You're entitled to it. So there's a lot of information about this, and New York State has become much more progressive around returning the voting rights of people who have been incarcerated. That's important to know. The last thing I want to say is these are important dates that are coming up right here. October 24th is the last day for the Board of Elections to receive an absentee ballot application. So if you want to apply, there's a portal, or you can go down to the Board of Elections and you can get the application, but then they need to receive it. Okay, they need to receive that application by October 24th. We've got 9 or 10 days of early voting starting October 29th to November 6th. So we can vote. We don't have to wait for Election Day. November 7th is the last day for in-person voting with an absentee ballot. And November 8th, that's Election Day, that's the last day to postmark your ballot. So if you're going to mail in an absentee ballot, you got to get it in the mail on November 8th. So these are just a few things to know. And then, oops, wait a minute. Now, let me see if I can get to this. We can make this available to you. Ken's got a great handout about it. But here, just as a closing image, all these people who stood up, who walked, who marched, who demanded that the federal government pass our voting rights. And they preceded us with this slogan, your vote is your voice. So I hope that inspires people. You have the right to vote, use it or lose it. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff now.
Thank you, Laura. You know, it is an amazing presentation, and it is deep and beautiful, and it also just touches the surface of the struggle.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of history alluded to what you said, and there's so much more, and it's so much deeper. I started Rejoice the Vote for the concept of what I felt the culture of voting was and is it feels like a chore. Thank you, Robert. It feels like a chore, and I want to have it feel like a celebration and joyful and something that we should be proud of. I mean, we celebrate July 4th, which gives us theoretically the opportunity to have voting and a democracy, because without voting, you don't have a democracy. Without a democracy, you don't have human rights. And so I want to talk a little bit about what we have tried to do to make it into a joyful moment, using the arts and working with young people and things like that. And I'll go through that. But the very first part we do is listed here at the bottom. We honor the past. There are hundreds and thousands of people who have worked on this, and most of the names we do not know. And we have these posters, and I'll talk about them in a second, but we also are celebrating the present. I'll talk a little bit more about how we're doing that, hopefully in a joyful, fun way. And we challenge the future, which is really what we're doing in the schools and in education and with young people around the country. So next slide, please. So these are two posters. And by the way, you can get these posters on rejoicethevote.org. And of course, up in the top left there is Dorothy Cotton. She was our community, and she deserves that #1 spot, so we can cheer her on. And I just wanted to just mention a few other people. Clauda Colvin, she sat on the bus before Rosa Parks. Most people never heard of her. Viola Luozo was a woman who drove down to a Selma march with 2 Black teenagers. She was shot and killed. And Jimmy Lee Jackson in the corner down there. It was the killing of Jimmy Lee Jackson that led to the Selma march. And people do not know his name. And we have several other posters. Now, these are just that recognize these folks. I also have this book of 100 women that worked on voting rights with SNCC. They're just a couple of paragraphs, and most of the names we never heard there. The next poster on to the right is the suffragettes, just some names to remember them. The name Charlotte Woodward is not there. She was the only woman alive when women got the right to vote. And she was 90 years old, 89 or 90 years old, and she couldn't vote because she was ill. And this just gives you a sense of the struggle that went on for close to 70 years for women to get the right to vote, which should have taken about 7 seconds, not 70 years. So go to the next slide. Thank you. The one on the left is a slide based on young people today who are working on voting rights. And they are also hundreds of them. Some of them I know. And one of the things when I looked at that slide on the left, that I realized that the breadth of their abilities and their races and their genders was amazing. And I didn't even think about that when I put it together. So Latasha Brown is African-American. She's probably the most well-known person there. Brianna C. is Chinese. Christine Newman Ortiz is a Latino woman, and Dakota Hall is from an indigenous group. And these are just young people around this country that are working on voting. And I want to mention that I have been working with them and others around the country through my role at the Ben & Jerry's Foundation. We've been funding a lot of these groups over the last 3 years, and their work is amazing, is deep, it's thoughtful, and they don't get the publicity of this work that's happening within the country right now to maintain voting rights and create a voting culture in the United States. So there are a lot of other folks doing that around the country. And actually in the last presidential election, it was a lot of an increase in youth voting that changed who became the president of the United States. The poster on the right is something we are using in schools. We'll be putting them into schools just to show that you can register to vote and to show there are the people that worked on it in the past and there are people who are working on it in the future. You can go to the next slide. The one on the left is honoring Dorothy. You know, we're going to honor Dorothy a lot and more into the future. I like that slide because on the top, on the left, there I am standing with Congressman John Lewis. Spent a couple of hours with him doing this kind of thing of how Ben & Jerry's was going to support voting rights. And one of the things we did was we came up with a flavor called empowerment, which we introduced with the Poor People's Campaign in North Carolina. And also from there went down to Florida. Well, I didn't go down to Florida, but people from the company to get what was called Amendment 4, that was for felons who were getting out of prison, getting the right to vote in Florida. It passed, and then they decided, okay, you can get your right back to vote, but you have to pay a lot of court costs and back payments. And so not very hard for people who had just got out of prison to pay their court costs and everything else. So they were not able to vote. That's an example of what Laura was talking about, how you move forward and then comes out to push back against you. She mentioned the Voting Rights Act that happened in 1965. It happened, the day it happened was August 6th. This year, Laura and I spent a couple of hours on the Commons doing registration and handing out this poster to honor that it was a celebration. We should be celebrating the day that the Voting Rights Act was passed, and that's August 6th. So if you're not doing anything next year on August 6th, you can celebrate the Voting Rights Act. Next slide, please. Yes, and we're doing artwork here we did a national art contest. You will recognize a couple of local people there. Cal Walker, many of you may know. Anna Goldsmith teaches art at LACS. Mary Ann is an artist here locally. People you might not know, Philip Agnew started the Dream Defenders after Trayvon Martin was killed. He sat in the governor's office with other students for 30 days protesting the Stand Your Ground law in Florida. Lola Ibrahim is somebody who has put the concept of art and social justice as part of her work around the country. And that this was, we honor John Lewis in this contest. Next slide, please. Here are the two winners that happened. These are young people. And the poster on the left, the vote for those who can't. I don't know if you can read the writing down there, but she talks about art being a way to communicate. And here she's communicating the facts in our country that you should be voting because a lot of people can't, and you have to get them their rights to vote. And that was her message there. The poster on the right is a poster that recognizes the folks that she's being held up by, that worked in the past, that that gave her the privilege to vote. And so that's an important poster. And these were 2 artists. We also, you can go on the website, you can see these, you can see arts of local winners, but these were the 2 national winners. Next slide, please. You'll see on this slide, this is in 2 years ago when we had the national election for president in 2020, we ran the Voting as City contest. The Voting as City contest is a contest in New York State that awards the cities, a large city and a small city, that get the highest percentage of eligible voters to the polls. And you can see on the left where I'm there in Albany with the mayor and people who worked on voting issues in their city. And we had a press conference around that to hand out the trophy. The one on the right is our one hoping that we will get Ithaca to become the voting city, smaller city in New York State as we move forward. And so we're kind of honoring that. And we'll be doing the Voting as City contest. Results will happen in 2022. We do it every 2 years when there are national elections. That makes it sort of equal. And so we will be doing that. I'm actually looking for somebody to help me do the data. And it's a compensated position. If anybody knows anybody that's interested in it, it's really hard to get the data sometimes because counties count their votes by county, not so much by city. Next slide, please. I wanted you to see how the trophy is a lot like that picture that the artist did. It represents somebody standing on the shoulders of folks, and they're named on the side panel, and there's a John Lewis quote on the back. Next slide, please. So you can, as I said, download the posters, register to vote, get voting info on our website, ideas for business and not-for-profits to encourage voting, links for young people to pre-register to vote, and then towns and cities can register to be in the contest. Next slide, please. So we're moving on, you know, we're doing work this year. Again, we'll be at LACS. We can be at other places. We are hoping and planning to have democracy voting murals put into every school in the Ithaca City School District. We will start probably with BJM and when we get the funds available to do that, and you can contribute to that on Ithaca Murals. We have done ice cream contests when Laura had some posters up and it had Harriet Tubman up there. We did a flavor honoring Harriet Tubman because her nickname was Minty. So we had a flavored ice cream. And Laura also gave us the idea of using a John Lewis ice cream called Good Trouble. And we had that and as ideas of just trying to bring some joy and fun into voting. I would love to see us also have the city of Ithaca have a holiday or a celebration time on the day we get to vote, doing something like dancing in the streets for our democracy. Thank you. That's what I got. Hope we can get some good questions.
Well, thank you so much, Laura and Jeff, for really great presentations. And we're going to welcome our audience to submit your questions in the chat function on YouTube. If you have any questions, comments that you have. We have about 15 more minutes, 16 more minutes to go before our time ends tonight. Okay, there is one from Joanna, who's part of our planning group, and she asked when will, or if the slides from these presentations will be available.
I'm thinking about it. I have to work on it. I'm very territorial. If you've ever met me, you know that about me. But I will sleep on it, and probably you'll get them. I don't know. Maybe we'll do it through you, Ken, rather than having people have to contact me directly. But I'm not sure. We'll work it out.
That'll be fine.
Okay.
I'm open to that.
All
That
right.
can work. And one of the things, Laura, that you said something in terms of voting, that, the voting is not just simply dependent on, or the fight for voting is not dependent just simply on charismatic leaders. And I was reminded of the famous Ella Baker quote, who is another champion of democracy, that, strong people don't need strong leaders. And that is the very premise, in fact, on which in many ways the Black Lives Matter movement has been built, sort of a decentralized approach to social action, not built upon the charisma of a leader. And if you could elaborate a little bit on that piece in terms of, people being able to take initiative in their own hands.
Well, I go back to something that Vincent Harding said. Vincent Harding was a very close associate and friend of Dr. King and of Dorothy Cotton, and he was one of our first national advisors, along with Jeff and others. And he came to Ithaca, I think
2008.
Well, he was here in 2013 for when they were gonna, he and Dorothy received the Martin Luther King Freedom Prize from the Fellowship of Reconciliation. And he was at GIAC and talking to some teens, and the teens were saying, weren't you afraid? And what he said was, honestly, I was so afraid I almost pissed my pants. But we never did anything alone. And if I started to lose heart, if we were walking, we were demonstrating, we always went together. And if I felt like I couldn't be at the front anymore, I would fall back and somebody else would grab a hold and move up in front. I always had company. So there were always people who were strong, and we didn't all have to be strong all the time. That really stayed with me because I can relate to that. Sometimes you just need to know that other people have your back and that they're walking side by side with you, or they'll even move out in front when you feel intimidated under the circumstances or you just feel shy. So there's a lot of power in having company. And sometimes the media will automatically put the microphone up to the person who's in front, who they think is in charge, and they will sort of anoint them as the leader of the movement or the person who started something, but they don't know all the people behind the scenes who worked like mad, typing the speeches. Andy Young talks about this, all of the women in the movement who really were the backbone of the movement. Ordinary people who were passionate and committed and who had persistence. And that's what it takes to change a society. It's not up to one person, because if you're a leader, you better have some people behind you following. Otherwise, you're not much of a leader. So we can do things much better when we're together, and we can think more brilliantly when we have multiple perspectives trying to solve a problem. Yes.
The bus rides down south was where people were so committed to each other, and so trusting of each other, that they would live by their commitment to nonviolence. That always gives me the chills to think, that how they had to feel that camaraderie and be in that space. That's an amazing thing to get on that bus. with your peers. I also wanted to just, Laura triggered something in my mind when she was saying that a lot of the movement in the 60s was led and by Black women.
Hmm.
A lot of the movement today is led by Black women.
Yes.
And I think it's an important thing to recognize all the time. And it's not everybody, but in so many places where where these groups of young people, they are led by women of color. And young women of color are really taken on the mantle. So it seems to be continuing in that direction.
I can attest to that personally. My mother, who is 96 years old now, was involved with the Baltimore chapter of CORE in the 50s and helped to desegregate Gwen Oak Park, which was a park in Baltimore County. And interestingly enough, when Gwen Oak Park was desegregated in August of 1963, the county executive who signed the desegregation order was Spiro Agnew. But that park, where I enjoyed many pleasant summer evenings, was opened up because of the work that she did and many other women who were involved in the Baltimore chapter of CORE, as well as men, of course, but still, that is something that resonates with me personally. There's a question from Joanna, and she says, thinking about the kind of educational and inspirational work that Dorothy Cotton did on citizenship education, how can that model be adapted here and now? We so badly need it.
Yeah, I tried to answer briefly. DCI is actually working on an updated citizenship education program for the 21st century. We did it a few years ago with Dorothy. It was very interesting trying to pin Dorothy down about what happened during those 5 days. Tell us, did you have an agenda? Is there a workbook? How do we reproduce it? And it was very interesting to try to have her reminisce about how it went and what the flow was like and what the parts were. But we did get a lot from her, and she helped to design an updated version. And it was different because the issues are different and not everyone locally is working on the same issues, but the principles of how to get yourself psyched up and ready to go talk to people who you think are in, positions of power, and get your voice going and say what it is you want to work on. We did a lot of that. So stay tuned, Joanna. Stay tuned. We know it's needed, and we've heard that from far and wide, actually. So happy to develop that. I see Elon has a question too.
Yes.
How did this get through to swing?
Can I just answer Joanna's question first, and then we go to Alon's question?
Yeah.
Hi, Alon. Hi, Joanna. There's a lot of things going on right now about that. So the groups of young people that I referred to, they don't just work at voting time. They work in their schools now. I was talking to a group down in Georgia that began with high school students who are now in college, and they have moved out and they're doing statewide work now. And they have just grown with it. So there's an internal, movement within that really doesn't get enough, press and support. So one of the ways is to find those groups and be supportive of them in many ways, and there really a lot of them. So and they really have started in high school, and the issues now, the 3 top issues of young people at this moment, the number 1 is the woman's right to choose. Number 2 is their struggle around economics. And number 3 is environmental stuff, not just about climate, but environmental justice. Those right now, if you were running for office and wanted to address those are the three major concerns of young people.
Mm.
I want to add one more thing about the essence of the CEP. There's a theory of change that we've developed about what we heard from Dorothy about how did they accomplish so much in 5 days? What was the secret sauce? The secret sauce was telling stories, sharing stories of how you're struggling, what is in your way, why are we getting mistreated, why are we being abused, how did it come to be this way? When people begin to share those stories and their aspirations for what they want instead, it's very powerful, because then you begin to see there's something very common that's happening to us. We just are isolated from each other. So break through the isolation, talk to people. And you're doing that, Joanna. You're out there, down on MLK Street trying to get people to register to vote. I heard you talking about it. But in the process, you're making conversation and you're getting to the humanity of the other people. And it's the same thing as I would say to you, Ilan, about how to communicate and persuade or influence people who are swing voters or independent, and maybe they could come over to where you want them to vote. You do it by knowing who they are, not by looking at them as a label, because inside we're mostly the same. We want the same things. We're human. We want something beautiful for our children. We want clean air. We want to live in a wonderful place. We want fresh water. We want to be paid adequately and respectfully. We want to be free to move around. We want a lot of the same stuff. And when you talk to people about what they care about, you might be surprised at how much we share. And then we can begin to influence each other about, what the resolution or the declaration or the politics of things. But it's first creating relationship with people. That's the power.
It's also the concept, and I know young people are working on this concept of controlling the narrative. It's an essence. It who controls the narrative. If you is a very, very important kind of concept, and they're using that language. It's around that and how the narrative happens. So an example of a narrative of somebody who gets accused of something, sometimes they respond with, that person who accused me and they start talking about that person, and that instead of talking about whether or not they actually did what they are accused of doing. I don't even want to mention the name of the person that I'm thinking of, who apparently was president for 4 years, but that's he's an expert of changing the narrative. You can accuse him of this, and then he attacks you, and he doesn't even defend what you're accusing of him. So it's a whole concept of narrative.
Interesting.
Well, Jeff, I have one question for each of you. Hold on, I got a couple of more messages. Those are. Oh, okay. Couple of comments. One by Laura about the 21st century version of the CEP, the Citizenship Education Program, and Phoebe Brown writes that my organization, AFJ, is working on getting the vote for humans incarcerated. How do you feel?
I'm all for it. Excuse me? Come on, Phoebe. You've met me. Of course I'm all for it.
Yeah.
When you go into a prison, and I have been inside prisons as a visitor, it's like a warehouse of brilliant, talented, powerful people in there. And it's like, what are you doing in here? Why don't you be back out in our neighborhood? How can we get you free? Because I guess there's a way that being incarcerated, if you can make some lemonade out of lemons,
Mhm.
It's a place where you really get clear and strong about yourself and what you care about, and your mind gets clear, and you there are people who are educating themselves in all kinds of ways and developing their spiritual life in all kinds of ways, because there's a certain kind of freedom that they found, that they created for themselves, even in that awful situation. So yeah, I want people to vote. Kidding me?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I'm right there, 120%. I think it serves them well. It serves our society well. It serves reentry well. It serves in so many ways. They should not lose that right ever. And I actually would have a discussion about whether the voting should be lowered to 16. But that's another topic. But you know that, and how we can make that happen. That's one of the posters actually refers to voting at 16.
I'd like to ask each of you one last question. I know this is partly in Jeff in your ballpark, but I also like for Laura to respond to it as well, about just talking about the infusing the idea of voting as celebration, as something that is celebratory, not a chore or a burden, but something that really changes. I mean, it really seeks to create a certain kind of culture around voting.
Well, you know, the vote running for office and vote has become such a negative thing. There's so much negativity around the whole concept of voting. Most people, when they, are accusing their opponent of being a horrible person, we need to have it. It should be joyful. Countries, we celebrated the Arab Spring, and we celebrate democracy everywhere, and we don't celebrate and flourish that we have it in this country. And to me, it is just it's a great way to meet the people who you live next door to, because we all live in Ithaca. We live in Ward 1. It's our neighborhood. And so that brings, the more we celebrate it, the more we will create neighborhood and community, and actually, pay attention to the human rights right here in Ithaca, New York, besides everywhere else in Tompkins County. So I just, and I think that's the way you communicate with people. Celebrations, I mean, are important things, and then you begin to recognize it, and it becomes important and something that people will not let you take it away. We won't let the courts take it away. We won't. You can give somebody water if they're standing on line. My gosh, oh, what a breakthrough in community. I mean, hey, you're thirsty? Here's some water. There's so many ways to look at it in every sense of it, and it makes the struggle for voting in democracy have a fun kind of side, a little friendly competition in cities, and so and using the arts to achieve it. So that's why it's more fun to do.
There's something about the effort that's involved. They do, there are places where you really do have to be determined and committed in order to actually successfully cast your vote. And you may feel like you're being thwarted. I think doing it together, asking people, do you need a ride? Are you going to go vote? Would you like to ride with me? Let's go have lunch, or let's have tea beforehand or something. Making it more of a social opportunity is one thing. And I think I have a relative who just got her citizenship a few months ago. And wow, she had to work hard to get that. Oh my goodness, it was not easy. And I am so respectful of her for how hard she had to try. But now she wants to register to vote, and she's really working hard, trying to figure out what to do. And this is not her, she doesn't speak English as a first language. So there's lots of effort, but I see how much it matters to her. She's part of this country now, and she wants her voice. She wants to be in on the democracy. She wants to influence it. And, we had a bottle of champagne in the house, because it was an achievement, partly because it was so difficult. And she wasn't bored. She wasn't disaffected about it. She still knew that was a prize. That was a really good thing to be able to do. And so the more we can sort of tell those stories of how people worked so hard and went to jail and got beat, and some of them got killed trying to get this right to vote for all of us. We should be using it, and we should be feeling really good that we've got it. So I can say should, but I know when I don't feel like going, I forgot, and now I have to go, and I have to, get to the poll at a certain. I push myself because I know how good I'm going to feel when I'm done. And I always do feel really good.
Yeah.
I feel like a grown-up.
Also, I think the more people that actually go vote, the candidates will change. It'll be it's an opportunity to encourage people to run when they feel there's support in the community and they know people are actually going to go do it. So that's to me is a value. It takes away a little bit of, it's not so much who has the deepest pocket, but it's who can create a relationship with their community that could somehow hopefully determine the winner.
Yeah, and winning feels good. When you put in the effort and you actually win, wow, that's great. But sometimes just the camaraderie and the relationships that you develop along the way, they have staying power. Even if your candidate doesn't win this time, you've got a coalition now.
Yeah.
You're talking about beloved community. That's what
I'm talking about.
Exactly. And I think too, in terms of your comments, it kind of reminds me of how relational voting can be. I remember in 1964, when I was a couple of weeks away from my 8th birthday, I went with my grandmother and mother and aunt to vote. And the polls were in the house of a neighbor around the corner. It happened to be my sister had a girlfriend whose grandparents lived around the corner, and there was a polling booth there. And I went with them, but that impression never left me. I was curious at that time, and what is she doing behind that curtain? But it was that type of thing that stays with you. This is almost 60 years later. I still remember that as clear as day. We had an elementary school named for Matthew Henson, which was brand new that year, but it was also, that became the polling place. And I would see the mothers of my childhood friends. And so there was something relational about that, and you saw these grown folks who were taking this thing with, some level of seriousness, and diligence.
I remember my parents taking us they were going to go vote, and we were so tired. We just wanted to go home. And why do we have to sit here? They were over there for 2.5 hours, and we were just like, oh God, what's going to happen? But we went as a family, and I could see, this is something that they take very seriously. We're all going to sit here and wait. And when we got out of there, we felt very relieved, but also it drove home that this was not something they were taking casually.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Well, I want to thank you both so very much for just excellent presentations in response to questions, and a great kickoff for this series of programming. And want to thank those who are remaining in our audience for your participation tonight. And we look forward to seeing you next month for part 2 in this series of programs that are being organized by our collective, which will have a name one day that we'll share with you. So again, thank you all for coming, and we will see you all in good night. And Laura and Jeffrey, let's hang on and connect up with Rob. So again, thank you all. Good night.
Publicly thank Rob for you. Thank you very much for making this work.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Jeff.